the Learning and Development Podcast, presented by 360 Learning. Hello, listener, and welcome to the Learning and Development Podcast. I'm David James, and today I'm speaking with Larry Durham and Jonathan 18 about a fascinating new report called Rebuilding L&D for an AI-Driven World. Larry and Jonathan, welcome to the Learning and Development Podcast.
Thanks for having us, David.
Me too. So first of all, let's kick things off. It's a fascinating report, I must say. What was the primary aim of this benchmark, and what are the headlines of the report relating to the current state of L&D?
That's a great question. It's kind of funny. We've been in this space in L&D for 20, 30 years, both of us. And as we got into it, our first thought was, do we really need another report out there? No shortage of reports on AI and what's happening in L&D. And we took a slightly different angle in terms of what we're trying to find. And our hypothesis was that there was some alignment, and I'll talk a little bit about that amongst L&D leaders, but we really wanted to focus on why they're not getting there, because most of the conversation we have with L&D leaders, with CLOs, is the struggle, right? Of what's mismatched between, as we'll talk about, the ambition and the successes that they're having. And what we found was maybe a couple of key highlights, and Jonathan can weigh in as well. A few of the highlights that we found was L&D is looking for the same thing. They're looking for AI-enabled, skills connected, embedded in the work, and business credible. And I think if I said that to any L&D function, they would violently agree. Yes, that's what we want. However, the constraint is not that. The constraint is not ambition. It's system alignment. And what we found, and we'll get into the report in a little bit, but what we found was the ambition to do all those things and what the work and the business needs is clear. But the way it's been structured, as without going into great detail, the design and development aspects that we do so well are mismatched in terms of where we spend our time, how we align, and how we actually change that. And so I think those are some of the highlights. We did a number of indices, and we'll talk about that throughout the podcast, around the alignment between the performance and execution gap, the skills and talent architecture, the AI readiness. So we put a number of indices. And the last thing I'll say before I let Jonathan chime in here is that we didn't just ask what people want. We asked, are you funded? Are you getting support, right? That's how we know that it's actually working. Is it funded, and is it in your strategy? And that's where we found the mismatch. And the biggest one on AI readiness, which everyone would say, yes, that's top priority. Over half of the respondents said that's our top priority. It was the least funded and the least strategic in terms of progress and execution. So when we talk about ambition heavy and execution light, that's exactly what we're talking about. It wasn't that they were close. The highest aspirations had the lowest progress. And that's what we found in our reporting and in the benchmark.
Yeah, brilliant. Before we do that, let's zoom out. And I wonder if you could highlight for us how AI is reshaping the nature of work and how this makes our traditional approaches to L&D perhaps inadequate. So more for build for all AI parrot for tomorrow. We see that for that.
Yeah. Jonathan, if I could add on to that, learning is always in service of the business, of the work to be done, right? We live in this space, so sometimes learning is the thing, but in reality, it's part of what we do. If I step back, we've spent an incredible amount of time within this report, but also outside this report, which is what's changing. First of all, sometimes as L&D, if we're not careful, we assume everything stays the same, except we're using AI within our group, but the work architecture changes. So we've been researching a lot and doing a fair amount of work with clients on workforce transformation. And if you think about how the work changes, there's 4 composite areas that we break capability into. I hesitate to use the word skill because there's a lot of meaning with skill these days, but skill and talent architecture, one of our metrics that we look at. What are the 4 things that individuals need? They need 1, declarative knowledge, regulation, detail, how do things work. I need understanding of knowledge and content and how things work. That's number 1. Number 2 is procedural tasks. Specifically, how do I do them in a sequence and in order to make things happen? Number 3, Jonathan just talked about, which is judgment. You hear the word sense making, and how do I operate in ambiguity, and how do I come out with answers within a tolerance, not A, B, C, or D, but in a range, right? And then finally is relational, folder management and other engagement and selling and the marketing of your idea. So everything we do, if you think about it, falls generally into those 4 composite groups. And I think the strain that we feel in L&D is if we say, hey, where does our curriculum fall in these areas? 80 to 90% fall in declarative knowledge and procedural tasks. We look at the work and the question is, what's happening with AI? If it's declarative knowledge and procedural tasks, AI can do it. Early work is they're not hiring individuals because they're pushing it to AI. And the rub we feel is not, can we figure out AI? That's still challenging for L&D. The rub we feel is what we produced, nobody needs, right? And I'm being a little bit emphatic to make a point there, but the majority of what we do doesn't align with what the business needs us to do anymore. And I think that's the real sock in the nose for us in L&D to say, this is why it feels unnatural, because we're misaligned on what the business needs from us.
We've over-indexed in one of those quadrants because it's where we developed our apprenticeship. A lot of us in the classroom or on an authoring tool. So our substance power, if you want to go down that route, is based on our pedagogical frame of reference and maybe even pedagogical identity. And I meet so many learning and development folks who falter in the other quadrants because there is an over-index and almost an overemphasis, looking at an over-reliance, on trying to move that pedagogical know-how into the other quadrants as a crutch almost. But of course you'll fall down. There's no position or structural power or influence or stakeholder, anything required to manage stakeholders inside that box. It's, you can see how that falls down.
Yeah, it's interesting. As they say, when you're pointing a finger, you're pointing 4 back at yourself. So really, Jonathan and I are pointing at ourselves. What I just said is not wrong, what L&D has done. It was right in the time. And so it's becoming outdated very quickly. AI is making it look archaic. And I think it's the real challenge of, if you think about L&D groups, we were largely built, we serve a lot of compliance oriented industries. And so my answers maybe, or my responses may be more towards that. It was a compliance mindset as opposed to a performance mindset, right? And so that's declarative knowledge and procedural tasks and multiple choice single answer and continuing professional education credits. And everyone was happy, right? We de-risked the business. Now it's shifting from compliance to performance, which is judgment, relational. Declarative knowledge is still there, but it's so much faster. It's so much different than what we've done. I think that misalignment is the rub and the grinding that we hear that feels so unnatural, because what we did became so outdated so quickly. I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, we are well said. And with so much of us with our identity wrapped up in our value that we offer organizations, you can see how moving so fast has created that schism. But Jonathan, you mentioned learning in the flow of work. Of course, it's been a prevalent term for many, many years. But in the report, you introduced the concept of work in the flow of learning. L&D love a buzzword. So we've got to speak over the groans here of the listener. Can you explain what this means and how it relates to the realities of facing workers today?
Yeah, I kind of chuckle when David, I agree with you. Sometimes, it's like that palindrome, right? Or whatever we call it, right? Where we just reverse it and it has intellectual weight to it. But without being cheeky on that weight, as I think about work in the flow of learning, like I said, I often go to the other end of the problem to look at it and say, what is it? From a learning and development perspective, work was the constant, right? It was fun. Even though, we were focused on compliance and things like that. If anyone looks around these days, all of a sudden the work is not the constant. And that's very interesting. We are working with organizations who say half of the work that our first, second, third year associates do, they won't do anymore because AI is doing it. And you think to yourself, okay, does that mean less training? What does that mean? All of a sudden, remember the declarative knowledge and the procedural tasks that you at least need to be aware of, because judgment doesn't form in the absence of those things. You need to at least be aware of them. We're at the point where when that breaks down, learning might be in a peculiar space. I'm not saying this is where it will be. Maybe the puck moves and we skate to something else. Recreating the work through simulation. And I'm not talking about simulation as we talk about today, but broader exposure to work. Sometimes I call it synthetic work, which that sounds a little ominous. No one wants more work, but creating environments and work where declarative knowledge, procedural tasks, judgment and relationship can be formed and developed, at least to a point. we've done a lot of research with our industries in aviation, right? They've been doing this for years, right, in the simulator, because they don't get the chance and the results are catastrophic if they don't get it right. I think in a lot of our environments, we're having to put work in the flow of learning, right? We're actually having to recreate work in the form of simulation, expose, experience, leadership, decision-making, a lot of the things that Jonathan talked about, to create an environment where we can develop people. I often go back to, it's old, but what's old is new again. If I go back to Peter Senge's book, right, and think about the discipline, I always wonder, learning is the only strategic competitive differentiator. I don't know that he ever meant that was L&D pumping out content. I think it was learning, right? Learning in the flow of work, and maybe work in the flow of learning, to synthetically create those experiences to develop people to perform when and how needed. And so it's not, while I love the concept of learning in the flow of work, it largely predicates that it's based on the fact that work is relatively constant. So we know where to interface and what to bring in as a learning thing that we can measure and then report out on. Then in reality, we'll likely be simulating work so that we can develop the learning. So when and where needed in the work, that application could be made, which is slightly different than what we thought. And again, it's not because what we were doing before was wrong. It just became quickly outdated given the way of work and how AI is coming about.
The conversation we've had so far, there's so much we've talked about, inevitably probably in L&D, about the heavy middle of ADDIE, of design and development, whether that be simulations, faster content, talked about LMSs and the like. But how does AI invert the bell curve of ADDIE, meaning that we focus more on the edges? And I suppose what does that mean then for the future of L&D resourcing?
Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Model. About it. Than need. AI. or wrong. No. Oh, that.
Yeah. One thing I would add on to that, if I could add on to what Jonathan said, moving to the edges in ADDIE is something that I think many L&D functions were trying even prior to the time, rebranding as performance consulting. And what is the problem? What's the lack of performance that the business has? How do we know it? Where's that happening? And so a couple of things are pushing that. The design and development peak of the bell curve, where probably 70-80% of resources are in L&D, is being pushed down because, again, the constraint was it takes time to design and develop these things. AI is removing that constraint. It's bringing it down. So if we did nothing differently, if we're still spending 80% of our time on this development, we just haven't taken the ball and run with it in terms of what AI can do. What that frees us up to do, I've done so many transformations in my lifetime where, we take away the tactical, people become strategic. We like to think that, but automatically the absence of execution doesn't necessarily bring strategy. But if you think about the ability of L&D, learning should really be a first order operation in the business. Let's throw the proverbial seat at the table conversation, right? I don't have a seat. If we don't have a seat going forward, it's because we didn't either take it or we didn't show up or whatever, because the reality is the performance consulting aspect of developing agents to monitor performance, to weigh in at a personalized level when and where necessary is a huge value. And I think learning is going to be a first order operation. Will L&D capitalize on it? That's probably a whole nother discussion around what's the future of L&D. And I don't think it's based on what AI is going to do. I think it's based on what L&D decides to do with AI. And if they do it right, I think it will be incredibly valuable when you start thinking about mobility, as we say, career lattices versus career ladders. Everything's going to be in somewhat disarray and highly mobile. I think L&D has a huge opportunity to enable that in terms of learning, not for compliance, but for performance. And I think that's why the ADDIE curve has to look different. It should look different. If it doesn't, then something's going awry within L&D.
Yeah. No, go for it.
One end, take evaluate the other end, which shows where that aligns with this. Automate. We are that process. The question is, take change around it, or place it for you. Full answer. That
Yeah, fascinating. Because you could look at, I take your view, Jonathan. You mentioned earlier that there is optimism to draw from this, even though it looks like it's almost doomed today, but it's optimism tomorrow because there's so much around identity, accepted practice, current expectations of stakeholder, and what looks and feels like success. If you're in the lane that AI can easily occupy, you're in trouble. But if you are looking at the opportunities, as you've said, at the edges, then we can get to the things that we haven't had the opportunity to get to, which is organization-wide skills gaps, which is actual enablement, because we isolated at the top, trying to create one-size-fits-all solutions across entire organizations that could never have affected, weren't even designed for performance. So the opportunity is huge, and there is no doubt about it. It's just that when you examine the current state and people within roles, you've got to take a look at that and say that, as you're probably reading between the lines of what you said here, it's unsustainable.
Around whether all you're right. For AI, and dialogue process about think so so fail. Claim design feel that involved. Stop that your play.
And you mentioned there, Jonathan, archetypes, and I've got questions about the indices in the report and the archetypes. What would make sense first to explore?
I think maybe we talk about let's talk about the indices. This is basically the construct. We mentioned this a little bit at the top of the podcast. We have 5. There's some others that we've contemplated, but the reality was we tried to figure out, like I said before, why, not to be dire, but why are we failing in this attempt, right? Why are we not making the progress that we want to make from an L&D perspective? And so there were 5, and let me quickly go over those. And then if Jonathan wants to talk about the archetypes, we can talk about that one. The overarching one was what we call PEGI, and it was just the performance execution, right? Where are we and where do we want to be and what's the delta there? And we found quite a distance between the ambition and the execution. We'll talk a little bit about that. So not only did we find that the priority was high, we found the alignment around what people believed was needed was high, right? Which is quite interesting. Usually when we do these types of reports where we read others' reports that are out there, there's not violent agreement on what this looks like. But we found that those things were quite high. So one thing we looked at was how far off are we between what we want to do and how we're executing. Some really interesting stats that we found from the other parts on the metrics we looked at. So PEGI was number one. One that's quite unique, and it was skills and talent architecture. What we have found is most of the L&D functions we work with, strangely enough, aren't aligned very well with HR and talent and mobility. It's like, oh, well, we just bumped into this group that we've never worked with before. And you're like, that's because we're in support of that, right? They're mobilizing people. It used to be a bad thing if people were moving around. And now it's like, well, with AI, they're going to have to be fungible and dexterity and everything else that's going to have to be moving on. So we looked at the skills and talent architecture, and that was from data infrastructure, measurement, career pathways, other things like that. How aligned was L&D to that, right? And we've done a lot of work on skills, but we know everyone loves it. And then they say, oh, shoot, we don't have the data to make that happen. So we looked at skills and talent architecture and how it aligned with learning. And this was a very, very high priority item, was skills and talent architecture. The next one was the AI Learning Readiness Index. That one sounds pretty obvious, but what we found was high aspiration around learning and the flow of work using AI. The execution of it couldn't have been any further apart, right? It was the thing, right? It was the number one thing, but it was the one with the least progress. People were talking about a pilot they did 2 years ago, but they hadn't really been able to scale it, didn't have budget for it, didn't have the skill to. We know what we need to do, but everything we need to do it, we don't have, and we don't have a path forward to do it really well. So that was the learning readiness, AI learning readiness. The last two were the Learning Business Credibility Index. And that was, we didn't call it measurement. Everyone's like, oh, wait, you have to be able to measure. You have to tell the value that you're bringing. It's, many people have measurement in L&D. It was, so what? Is it making a difference, right? Is it performance consulting oriented? Most of the time, the answer was the business knew it was there, but not believed. Did we have enough people take courses? It's almost a cultural element, right? Of enough people took it and how much did we spend? And that seems reasonable and de-risk. And so I think there's some cultural issues, but that was the Business Credibility Index. And then finally was the Operating Model Adaptability Index, which was not just your traditional consolidated, federated, distributed, but what's the trajectory? And we found that most are thinking the same thing. There's this push and pull between, if we're using AI, shouldn't we all be using the same? So we should be one L&D across large functions. And then at the same time, the nature of AI is highly distributed. Is it more of a federated, as we like to say, freedom and a framework type of mindset? So those were the 5 dimensions where we found a lot of aspiration, a lot of ambition, but not a lot of execution. Jonathan, I may have you talk a little bit about the archetypes because it was abundantly clear where most of the groups were falling.
So, one of and that quite mine and I oh, AI right? It really. Another way, um, AI they arrive themselves and AI actually now. Next one, oh, that base that that the fourth ensuring consistent correct right out right
Yeah.
what okay. But AI but look like where offline.
No, I think you've hit on those four archetypes well. Like I said, the whole purpose of this research wasn't to go to the end and say, we found the smoking gun, but it does highlight the fact that what most people, it's putting a name to what most people felt. And just to tie back to one other thing you said, Jonathan, looking forward, we think a lot about the learning function. They are our client. That's who we work with. I'll use my palindrome again of we think more about the function of learning than we do the learning function. Now, again, that's not an amazing epiphany or anything like that, but reality is what we deal with in L&D is that form is going to follow the function. And the real question is, I think we get stranded sometime when we look at these archetypes and we stare in our function and we stare at the ADDIE model and we stare at our resource load. And then we try and work backwards. And when we start that way, we always wind up with something that feels sub-optimized, right? Because it's just too big of a lift to try and do something radically transformational. And so I do think this is a progression, but I do think more important than the archetypes, it is practically thinking about what does this look like? How do you support talent mobility? How do you support work in the flow of learning? It doesn't have to be a Herculean effort, but there does have to be a recognition that we're moving away from programmatic development of content in long cycle times. That's just a world that went away very, very quickly. And now we're in the midst of it. Maybe we've got a short amount of time left to live in that world, but we've really got to transition quickly to get to something that supports the business. Otherwise, I do fear that L&D may be a highly distributed, more than we would like, capability, because it's a functional need. It's a first order operation, and the business says it's just like order to cash in finance or something. It's so fundamental. We've got to own it directly and just execute the heck out of it. So I think we have a real opportunity if done right, or we have a real risk. Maybe that's AI in a nutshell as well. If it's done right, it thrive, and if you don't, could be the demise.
And I love, and again, I point to the optimism, whether L&D operates as a first order operation in the organizations. I'll leave to the listener to assess whether they are there right now or whether that's a journey that they need to go on. But look, there's one thing that the listener is going to agree with me on, which is there is an enormous amount to take in, both in the report and in this conversation. So were you to sum up the change that the listener needs to pay most attention to, and perhaps what they need to do now, what would you suggest?
Stuff out there. AI. No one. I think God about their own. The structure. Second, I think there's like later on about boy stuff around and we're on by scale stuff. Side, right, out, right, side, skill,
One thing I'll add, and I'll make it quick. I think from an L&D perspective, I think we live in a world where, first of all, we show up with an AI solution that is so impressive. Or you have an idea today and you wake up tomorrow and it's already been done and you think, oh my goodness, this is the world we're living in. Things are moving so quick. Why even try, right? Someone's already done it. I think for L&D, be fanatical about the need for learning and the change that's happening in your organization. Show up to the business and impress the heck out of them with how well you understand what's changing in the business and what's coming. I think the old Einstein quote, right? If the world was ending in an hour, you'd spend 55 minutes framing the problem and 5 minutes, executing the solution. I think we should probably in L&D think about what the business needs from a learning perspective and frame it so eloquently. We've been doing this recently with some of the regulated environments around judgment, where the regulator is starting to say judgment's paramount. If we can frame the implications of that and where that's happening, what the learning solution might be and how we report that back, even before you get to the solution, people are enamored and like, that is what we need, right? You haven't even shown them anything and they're like, I don't know what it is, but that's what we need to solve. I think we've got to get fanatical about, back to that performance consulting. What are the problems we're solving? Who are we aligning with? How are we strategizing on what a solution can look like and co-creating out at the business? I think that's a great first start versus let's get into a room for a day, look at our organizational chart, put some boxes in different places, rename ourselves. The business isn't enamored with that. They haven't seen anything. And I think it's almost like the action learning type things we do in L&D, right? It's putting skin on these concepts. And I think if we put skin on the challenges with an eye towards solving it, I think that's a great first step to get L&D into a better position in an AI-enabled world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This has been a hugely enlightening conversation. And of course, there's a huge amount more detail in the report that I'll put a link to in the show notes, as well as links to your LinkedIn profiles, if that's okay, so that the listener can connect. But look, I really appreciate you sharing so much. It's the report is well worth the listener's time to go deep and explore. And all that's left for me to say is Larry and Jonathan, thank you very much for being guests on the Learning and Development Podcast.